about, there's been a lot of back and forth about what Diddy's sentencing is going to be. Obviously, we had a weird situation the other day where Diddy's team seemed like they were going to try and get his sentencing expedited, but then they seemingly met with the prosecution. They pulled back and said, we'll just take a little bit more time. Now we hear this from the judge seemingly saying, I want you guys to figure out what you think the sentence should be, which is interesting to see, obviously. So shout out to Megan Cuniff over on X. She posted this order that we're going to read here in a second. She also says Judge AS, as we call him over here, because I can't pronounce his last name, knows he has a lot on his plate with the sentencing of Diddy. To prepare, he wants the attorneys to find cases like Diddy's where the offense levels were calculated based on transportation to engage in prostitution and the lowest criminal history, because Diddy does not have a, well, we won't say he doesn't have a criminal history. He just hasn't been charged with anything. This is the first time he's been charged and found guilty of a crime. So what did the judge say? Judge AS, the United States District Judge, says this: in connection with this sentencing proceeding in this case, the court would find it helpful to have available data on sentences imposed where, 1, the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 USC, you guys know, or 2, the base offense level under the sentencing guidelines was calculated under 2G1.A, or and a criminal history of category 1. Now, we were speculating yesterday in the last video. We talked about why in the world would the prosecution and the defense come to an agreement to just keep the October date and leave Diddy in jail? We had no idea. We were speculating or wondering why they could do that. Now that we hear this from the judge, it seems like they could have been anticipating that the judge was going to need some time to figure out this case, because let's be real. We've heard it from several attorneys. We heard it from Harvey Levin over on TMZ, and they said if Diddy was just going to get charged for this transportation for prostitution, then the feds would have never brought this case in the first place. So now the judge is like, man, we were supposed to get a RICO charge. We didn't get that. We were supposed to get this trafficking. That's why we're here. We didn't get that. So can y'all tell me what to do? Because really, this should have been state level charges and he should have gotten a misdemeanor. So now I need you guys to find me some cases where this happened, because the feds don't usually lose. They've got a 98% success rate. So he goes on to say the parties should locate cases that they believe match the criteria and file a letter, hopefully a joint letter, identifying those cases by docket number and jurisdiction on or before September 1st of 2025. No argument should be included with this letter. He's like, hey, I don't want to hear why you guys think this applies. If it applies, it applies. If not, it doesn't. I'll make that decision. Just give me the information so I can plan and adjust accordingly. This is going to be interesting to see what both sides say in response and how they come to an agreement. As we mentioned before, the prosecution is only looking for, I think, a maximum of 5 years. Is that what they said? 51 to 62 months. So they should be able to find some cases on both sides that actually say maybe it needs to be lesser. So this could be another win for Diddy. The goal here, the judge says, is for the parties' subsequent sentencing submissions to address the cases identified in the September 1 filing, focusing on those that each side believes reflect sentences imposed for similarly situated defendants, if any. The court appreciates the parties' assistance in identifying these cases, and as this information is not presently available from the Sentencing Commission. So ordered July 9th. So it was yesterday afternoon, which that's an interesting last statement. Because does that mean something like this hasn't really happened? I can imagine it has, but I would be interested to know what these violations look like. And if there's been a case, and a federal case specifically, where someone has gone up there, they've been accused of a RICO and trafficking and only found guilty on a lesser charge. I mean, that's got to be 2% of the federal cases if they have a 98% success rate, right? How much digging are they going to have to do to find this information? probably why they needed more time. So it's all starting to make sense. Let's get into this article from Megan Cuniff. I will be posting a link to this in the description as well. And what does she have to say? She says the feds indicate at least 6 to 8 years in prison as the judge finalizes Diddy's sentencing date. Now, this was posted the day before. And Megan says prosecutors appear ready for a novel argument under a recent federal guideline amendment that prohibits acquitted conduct from being considered at sentencing. So that's interesting because the judge even said, because you guys admitted that Diddy was violent and that if this was a domestic violence case, then Diddy would be thrown in jail. No problem. So let's see what they had to say here. Diddy will be sentenced on October 3rd after his lawyers on Tuesday abandoned their request to expedite the hearing. The 55-year-old rapper will remain at MDC in Brooklyn because a U.S. District Judge, AS, rejected his bail request last week. Diddy's lawyers requested a September 22 sentencing in a joint letter with prosecutors filed early Tuesday, but they filed another letter later in the morning that requested the original October 3rd date. Prosecutors and the U.S. Probation Office will evaluate Combs and make its own sentencing recommendation, and they didn't object. Judge AS authorized the schedule following a short phone hearing in which his deputy clerk said he'd respond to the scheduling request in writing. Diddy faces up to 10 years in prison for each of the two convictions, as we know, 20 years total for interstate transportation for the purpose of prostitution. But prosecutors say their preliminary calculation of his standard range under the U.S. Sentencing Commission guidelines is 51 to 63 months. His lawyer says it's 21 to 27 months. So there's back and forth there. Again, another reason they probably need some more time to find case law on this. Prosecutors didn't include it in their 51 to 63 month calculation, but they said they plan to seek a 4-point enhancement to Combs' offense level. Oh my, which is a key component to federal sentencing for offenses involving fraud or coercion. But there wasn't anything he was found guilty of that included fraud or coercion. So that's interesting. Judge AS agrees that would increase Combs' standard range from 78 to 97 months in prison, which in 6 years and 6 months to slightly more than 8 years. Wow. Prosecution also indicated they may seek other enhancements because they haven't, quote, had adequate time to carefully consider all potentially applicable guideline provisions. The defense sentencing position is due September 19th, and the prosecutors are to file their position on September 26th. Prosecutors detailed their preliminary 51 to 63 month range in filing last week that argued against Combs' bail request. And they said it could increase because evidence related to the convictions overlaps substantially with the evidence related to the trafficking count. So again, we now see that the reason they needed more time is because they want to be able to prove that they're trying to over-sentence him. The prosecution's trying to over-sentence Diddy. And obviously, Diddy probably said, no, I'll send it. If I've got to stay here a little bit longer for you guys to figure out and get me out sooner, then we'll have to do that, right? That's a tough decision to make. I can't imagine. Prosecutors cite a U.S. Sentencing Commission guideline that was amended in November of last year to exclude acquitted conduct from being considered relevant conduct at sentencing. So those 4 points that they're trying to add and then give him another 2 years, the defense is saying that that shouldn't be allowed. Prosecutors emphasize in trial that interstate transportation for prostitution is illegal, even if everyone involved consents. That's true. It's a dumb rule, a dumb law, but it is what it is. But jurors had no way of indicating on their verdict sheet if they believed the commercial intercourse acts at the center of the transportation acts were consensual, which I think they would. Hearing from the alternate juror, I think we could all agree that they would probably think it was consensual as well. The acquittal on the trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion charges indicates the jury agreed it was, but that isn't enough to stop prosecutors from seeking more prison time for the transportation convictions because Combs used fraud or coercion to commit those crimes. But you also can't assume that. Prosecutors' 8-page filing last week cites the overlapping evidence on the trafficking and transportation charges when arguing that much of this conduct is not included in the guidelines definition of acquitted conduct and may be relevant to the guidelines circulation. I don't see how they could do that, especially when Diddy was found not guilty on those charges. But I guess we would have to look at whatever was amended. This U.S. Sentencing Commission guideline was amended to get more information there. I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to let the attorneys handle that one. And may be relevant to the guidelines calculation. They warned, however, the government requires additional time to consider any other potential enhancements or cross-references that may be applicable. Michael Friedman, a criminal defense attorney in LA, and said the new amendment and prosecutors' enhancement arguments sets the stage for an unusual sentencing decision for Judge A.S. that will be ripe for appeal. This is an avant-garde federal sentencing litigation, Friedman said. Friedman said prosecutors are going to act as, quote, if they won and he did everything that they said he did. You can't do that. He was found not guilty. And they are going to try to shoehorn that into the guidelines, and it's going to get a little bit messy. The judge has to make the right decision here. These are novel amendments, so this is just going to be fodder for appeal. And then Megan goes on to talk about the prosecution wanting more prison time for his obstruction of justice. We're not going to get into that today. I'll leave a link to this article. Very well done by Megan Kunis. Shout out to her. She's done a great job covering this trial. Let me know what you guys think. Is this a good sign or a bad sign for Diddy? Again, with the federal government having a 98% success rate, I can imagine that it's going to be difficult to find these specific charges or a case where, I mean, the jury is basically calling, they're calling the quote unquote victims women of the night and prostitutes. I can imagine that the federal government would have several cases that show this charge only being found guilty of. So let me know what you guys think about this in the comments in the chat. Very interesting